Welcome to our
Welcome.
emotional trauma and healing chat number 14.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, wherever you are. How is everyone doing?
Very well. It's another Sunday. It's another meeting.
Are you got we're off here in the U.S. on Monday. We have Labor Day. Do you guys have any um I don't know official holidays coming up in Germany?
Nope.
No?
Business as usual.
Got it. Well, I am excited because then tomorrow I don't have to work either. So it's gonna be a nice, relaxing weekend, and I'm glad we didn't have a session last. We didn't talk about anything last Sunday, which gave me a little bit more time to open up the talk about more stuff, research more stuff, go more in depth about things that maybe we have glossed over. And yeah, do you guys want to get started? Okay, perfect. So I want to talk about something that we've talked about so many things regarding, relationships and trauma and how it affects our life and what it can look like. Um, and I think that we haven't really talked about, I don't want to, I guess, like the elephant in the room, and that is that what we label right now as, you know, mental illness disorders. And I wanted to start with something that I feel is um, one of the most common, let's call it mental illness. I don't like that term, to be honest, but um, just for the sake of talking about this, let's just talk about anxiety. Anxiety, at least in the US, affects around 40 million adults, 18 and older. I'm looking at some stats right now. 18.1 of the population every year. Anxiety disorders are highly treatable, yet only 36.9 of those suffering receive treatment. People with anxiety disorder are 3 to 5 times more likely to go to the doctor and 6 times more likely to be hospitalized for psychiatric disorders than those who do not suffer from anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders develop from a complex set of risk factors, including genetics, brain chemistry, personality, and life events. Um, that is such a big word. I feel like anxiety is such it just doesn't do justice to what goes on within somebody's experience and to what they might be feeling. Um, so I want to open up the floor and let you guys talk about what anxiety is from a perspective of both trauma and maybe Daniel from a perspective of the clinical community and what a psychologist would tell you. So, whoever wants to talk first, feel free.
Okay, so let me give that a go. First of all, from where I'm sitting, anxiety is just a sort of like top label for so many different things that might be going on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually that's one of the conditions that need the most differential diagnosing until you come up with a possible cause of it. And very often there are multiple causes. Again, seen from a perspective of primary cell and the types of trauma that we have identified there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we're assuming here anything that is not calm, peaceful, and light is trauma based.
Okay.
So there's really not much more to say at that level, really, from my perspective, because like I said, it just needs diagnosing what triggered it and where it's really coming from and what's going on in the primary cell. It can be anything from trying to avoid a regular trauma, or it can be a structural problem in the primary cell. Um, there are so many possible causes here. Yeah.
Okay.
See, and that is somehow the difference between what you were just quoting, the stats about anxiety, and and the peak states approach. Okay, the
Okay.
stats anxiety is a description of some sort of emotion somebody has, and it has been classified. For me, very interesting is that anxiety and fear are words which are commonly used in the English language, while, for example, in German language, we also have a translation for anxiety, but it's not that commonly used. So it's all fear. It's globalized under the what we would call fear. So it's a little bit difficult
I think
Okay.
it
to translate.
means something slightly different. The words
Really?
are slightly different in their meaning. Yeah.
So to make it clear, in German, fear would be Angst, and anxiety would be translated with Ängstlichkeit, and that is something
Oh,
not in common language, not probably used.
okay.
While in English, anxiety and fear are words which you hear commonly. Okay, so
Yeah.
they also see that from the different perspective, that it's while in Germany it's all subsumized under the term of Angst, but
For
yeah, we don't differentiate it
no.
that well in German language. But as Inka pointed out, it's from Peakswit's perspective, it's just a description, an observation. Okay, somebody says I feel anxiety, and that's not does not talk about the root cause, and that's something we have in these trauma talks we have discovered multiple times. While in the regular world, in the psychiatric psychology world, um, it's an ICD-10 diagnosis or ICD-11 or DSM-5 or whatever, but it actually doesn't really explain where it comes from,
Yeah.
and it's just a descriptive category term, and therefore I think the stats are very impressive. Yeah, when you say that 18 something percent a year will experience anxiety of the U.S. population, it's a lot. Okay, but
Yeah.
if you now if you now go and look, like, is that what Inga said? Is that just avoiding trauma, or is it this and this cause? It might be different.
Okay. Um, I think gathering from what you guys are saying, I think one of the other differing, aside from language, and the fact that language is very limited, and also culturally might mean different things, is that uh, I feel like anxiety can manifest differently in different people. Um, whether it's because of lack of education around people that might not, they don't, maybe they don't have other people around them that have felt the way they do, so they just use the language they may have. Whether it's because the culture, I feel like in the US that word is used a lot, right? So we say that a lot, like, oh, I'm so anxious, I'm so anxious. And sometimes people, I don't want to take anything away from anybody that they might be feeling, so I hope nobody takes this the wrong way, but sometimes anxiety can be uh used when you might be feeling nervous or fear, and the response that people have for anxiety is different. Like, um we can talk about panic attacks, and panic attacks and anxiety attacks are a different form of anxiety, and they might manifest differently than something you may call, as you said, in like the ICD-10 or the DSM-5, as like a general anxiety disorder. There are people who have OCD, right? And and there are people who have like they call it puro, right? Which is more like intrusive thoughts. It's not necessarily like you have to do compulsions to feel better. You have like these intrusive thoughts that are obsessive in nature. Um, and so I think it's like you're saying, it's very hard to, the more I listen to like the trauma perspective and trauma informed and body centered therapies, it seems like people feel anxiety different, or they might not even know they're anxious, and that's what's going on with them. I, for example, um recently have been starting to feel anxiety, and I never thought I was somebody that was anxious, but I mean, it's in there. It's in there somewhere, and it's only coming out with recent things. I tend to feel more somatic stuff and even more dissociative sensations, but anxiety is something that I'm noticing is something that my body knows how to run away from very well. Um, so talking about differentiating. I'm looking at. I'm trying to combine what you guys are saying. I'm trying to combine what stats are saying, and I'm looking actually at the peak states book and what you guys have, and it seems like there's so many things that can be stemming from this feeling of anxiety. And so I see, copies, what you guys call copies, holes, biographical trauma, body associations, generational fears. So when you guys in Germany are talking, and I'm talking a lot, so I'll just try to summarize it. Is anxiety then more than just one feeling, or is it? It could be a bunch of feelings.
So here's the crux. How do you know that person A that says they have anxiety and person B that have anxiety? How can you ever know that they're really talking about this exact same perception of their emotion?
Yeah, you can't.
Yeah. So we don't even know if the person who says I'm seeing the color blue and the other person says I'm seeing the color blue are really seeing the same blue in the same way. So much less that anxiety thing. Yeah.
Well, with the blue,
Have to
we can
rely on what
standardize it.
they learned to call that feeling.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
While with colors, we can standardize it because we can color an area blue and say, okay, this is blue and this is navy blue and this is whatever. And then everybody has to basically buy that definition with some
Sure.
inside feelings. How can you do it?
No, actually, there are people who cannot see blue because they were not taught that color. They are calling it another thing that they're summing it up under anything that's kind of like in the range of green.
Yeah.
Blue comes into that for them.
Okay, yeah, that makes
And
sense.
there's the Eskimos who, I don't know, have like 20 or 30 different words for white, which we couldn't perceive because we've not been trained.
Right, they see
That
so
connection
much
in our
snow
brains, yeah.
that they have many.
Yeah.
Okay, because they have so much snow that they just
Exactly. I mean, their environment is basically 90% white, I guess. So they have
yeah.
differentiated that very clearly.
Uh-huh.
We haven't learned that. We haven't made those connections in our brains. So it will be totally different. So I guess the same thing goes for emotions. If, depending on what your culture promotes, what you have learned to connect, like your sensations in the body are corresponding to that and that emotion, that's what you will tell. And that's probably how come so many Americans will talk about anxiety and Germans don't talk about Ängstlichkeit because our stuff is different. Yeah. We have all kinds of other problems. Yeah. But that's one problem we don't seem to have.
Okay, that's a really interesting take, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, language. I feel like regardless, language is always going to be limited because for whatever reason, it's very complicated. And I'm sure you guys as therapists see this more than most, especially because you're not like when you think about people that go to therapy, people they try to talk about what's going on in their lives and stuff and what they don't like or what they perceive about their world or their friendships or whatever. It's I feel like it's more concrete. But when you're talking about somatic and body center therapies, you're talking about these inner feelings, and it's very hard to make someone understand, but B, it's also very hard to explain it to yourself, like when you're talking inside and you're saying like, oh, I feel this like pointy or this dull or this, like you're using these sensations that don't necessarily give the therapist or the facilitator um like immediate information. Does that make sense?
Beg to differ. I beg to differ.
Well, because you've been doing it for so long, right?
Yeah, but in fact, it turns out those perceptions are much more the common denominator than the names for the emotions.
Okay. So that's a better way of diagnosing and finding techniques to use to help people. Okay.
Yeah.
That's fair. So that's a much better language than when people come in and tell you like, oh, I just don't like my job, or or like my life feels terrible or stuff like that.
Yeah, because then we just have to go and whittle it down to what's really going on in your body when you say that.
Okay. Okay. What about things like what what can be done about sensations like anxiety? This when people come to you and they tell you that they're feeling anxious, what tends to be like, let's say we're talking about generalized anxiety disorder. When people come to you for that and they tell you like I'm a very anxious person or I'm anxious about life or whatever, what are the things that they're coming into usually telling you, and what are the things that you can usually do to help them out?
Yeah. Sorry, but it doesn't work like that. You
Okay.
can't just say and identify with a diagnosis. That's just not how it works. Yeah. We need to figure out what's really going on. And that can
Okay.
be so many things. And it boils down to that whole list that you just named. We would be checking all
Got
of
it.
these options if they are in alignment with the perception here or not.
I can tell you what we're not going to do. We're
Mhm.
not going to ask you about your whole biography. We're not going to prescribe you any pills, yeah, or any drugs. We're just going to talk to you and try to, with your description, yeah, for example, whenever I open the car door, I feel then that sensation. We will ask around that sensation, around the situation, around similar situations where similar sensations come up. When was the first time that this was happening, and much more questions around this thing. Okay, and from there we're basically doing the peak states diagnosing, and then if you like also the treatment.
Okay. Okay. That
Okay.
yeah, that makes sense.
Doesn't sound so fancy, but it's very effective, and at least to my understanding and to my yeah, from my experience. But it's but sometimes, and I have to give that as basically a disclaimer. Sometimes there's an anxiety which even also peak states can't understand. Okay, anxiety is one of these problems which is very some can be very complicated.
Okay. That's good to know. Yeah, and I guess I keep repeating the same questions because I'm so used to thinking about it in this
Yeah.
psychology perspective.
Yeah, so see, anxiety can simply come from an overdose of caffeine. Yeah. So if
Yeah.
you're used to just drinking this by the liter, your Coke and your coffee, and then you come to me and say, I'm anxious, I'm anxious. Yeah, of course you are anxious, but it's not something that needs this type of intervention. Yeah. So you just use your common sense and say, okay, you know what? Why don't you just stop getting
Okay.
the sort of chemical into your body that is designed to make you hyper and anxious, and you have to use that energy for something else, not sit still. Yeah.
Okay.
Get it out of your
Um.
system. Just one example. Yeah.
Sure. But would it be, even though these, like for example with the Coke, sometimes we talk about when we have these discussions that there's always an under, even if something pops up, there's always an underlying thing that's feeding it. So like if I feel anxious during my what's something else, like my work day, like if I were to go to work, um what's making me anxious isn't my work, it's something much deeper. But does that still apply to when, like the example of Coke? It doesn't seem like it is. Like if I drink a lot of coffee, um and I get anxious, what if there's somebody who drinks a lot of coffee but doesn't get anxious because they don't have this predisposition to anxiety? Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
People are different. That's one of the basic sets here that we're operating on. Yeah.
Right. So if I were to drink a lot of coffee and get anxious, would that still not kind of be an opportunity for me to heal my predisposition to those high levels of anxiety?
Nope.
How come?
It's like jumping off a roof and say, you know what, let's take this opportunity to heal my fear of falling. not a smart idea.
Okay, but I won't die from coke. I'm just saying.
You know,
Coke. I mean, not immediately. Maybe in a couple of decades, but I'm just saying it as a form of a trigger. Does that make sense?
no, it just well, what it is not proper taking care of yourself, and then you might
Sure.
want to look into why are you not taking proper care of yourself? Where did you learn that? What program are you running that you're basically doing self-destructive stuff?
Okay.
So that's what we would look
Sure.
into here,
Okay.
and we would do that after you know dialed down the caffeine in your bloodstreams.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. We I guess this question is maybe it might be redundant. It might be, but I feel like I have to ask it. Um, if we're going back to like what we have classified outside of the peak states info, but more on the DSM and stuff, when we talk about anxiety and stuff, sometimes we fall into these categories that are like OCD, like anorexia, like bulimia, like social anxiety, right? And I bring them up um, because sometimes they're called like anorexia nervosa, so they're categorized within this anxiety part. Um, and I recently had the opportunity to talk to some people, and when they talk about these things like anxiety, like social anxiety, um, and and anorexia and bulimia, I always assumed that they just felt uncomfortable. They just felt uncomfortable, and that was it. Um, and for whatever reason, they couldn't really get past those feelings until those feelings were very, very strong. That made them act out those behaviors. Um, and recently, I had the opportunity to talk to some people, and I didn't. I know it makes perfect sense, but it just didn't to me for whatever reason. There was always these feelings. There's always these thoughts attached to these feelings. Like for example, the opportunity I had to talk to somebody with social anxiety was I perceived that this person was just um, shy, overwhelmed with this intense feeling of anxiety. Let's just call it that for right now, and it made her not like it made her really shy. It made her not respond quickly and feel uncomfortable. But then this person told me that they also had these thoughts that came with these feelings, which were, like this person felt like uh they weren't they weren't good enough, or they weren't important enough, and that they were taking up people's time. um, you guys talk a lot about how trauma. I know in the videos I've seen from the peak states and Grant's work, especially specifically him talking about it, is that whenever we have trauma, sometimes at the moment of trauma, we associate, or we create a belief, or we create a word, or we create a sentence that kind of colors our life. And that's what it made me think of. It made me think of, there must have been at some point in this person's life, something happened that made her think, I'm wasting people's time with my presence. And that manifested as social anxiety. Let's just call it that for the sake of making it easier. But the behaviors are that they feel uncomfortable around people. They think they're taking up their time, and a host of other things that happen. Um, I think it's interesting because we call it social anxiety, but it's so much more complex than that. It's not just anxiety. It's their self worth, their perception of themselves, their perception of how the world sees them. Um, but you know, do you feel like? I guess I don't really have a question for that. I just found it really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
If I can just put my 5 cents worth in there,
yeah,
it's
please.
it's really a bit the other way around. Yeah. It starts out with not feeling good enough as an ingrained pattern, probably generational in origin. And then all these other behaviors kind of like plant themselves on top of it. Yeah. So because I'm not good enough, I feel that actually my presence is a burden for others, or I'm taking time away from them. And that makes me uncomfortable because I'm permanently in conflict with the people that, or in a perceived conflict that I would want to be with. Yeah. But I feel that I'm not really good enough to be with.
Okay. So are you saying?
And there's another thing, and we already covered that in one of the earlier episodes, but from our observational standpoint, we might get the idea that something happened in that person's life, and therefore that person developed that trait or that belief or whatever. The peak states model says that this, as Inka pointed out, it might be inherited, it might be generational, that this lesion, that trauma happened before, happened either as an inheritance from your ancestors, or during your development, during the development of the egg, of the sperm, and after conception of the egg sperm together of you. And that you just in that situation become aware of that situation, because that trauma basically doesn't allow you to process certain situation, doesn't allow you to create a certain protein that you need in that situation, and then you become aware of that trauma, and then your mind interprets that in a way, and then this sentence stick. And I find that model very intriguing, though it's completely the opposite of regular belief currently, or current psychological belief, because in psychology, the belief is that you are born, that then basically life starts, okay? which yet we know that is untrue. So we know that people within the mother already receive what happens there. But anyway, it says in the first 8 years, you're basically conditioned to your behaviors, and then out of these 8 years, there are like EEG readings, and then there's certain different EEG waves that you can see in certain development areas. Your personality derives, and out of that personality, basically your behavior derives. And the peak states model goes a little bit earlier, as I said. It's becoming aware of. Okay, you come into you get into a situation where you notice, oh, there's trauma that doesn't feel well, and then your mind creates a model and a reason out of it.
Got it. It's like we were talking about it earlier, right? So the mind creates or makes up a story based on the kind of input it receives.
Yes.
Okay. So it's backwards. But let
me just add one more thing, because you talked about eating disorders and so on. The interesting thing, for example, in schema therapy, we already now see, even in mainstream psychology, that that certain behaviors, for example, eating disorders, or like compulsive disorders or behaviors, are a way to reduce stress. So they're a coping mechanism and not actually the disease itself, not the root cause. Okay, but they are just a coping mechanism to reduce internal stress, and then there's a conditioning of a certain behavior. And you can see that, for example, the Institute has an extensive the Institute for the Study of Peak States has a webpage about OCD, about the OCD project, and there are even some research processes, I think, that work pretty nicely. And but the problem is always what you call OCD. For example, I had a patient, and she said that she had OCD and was diagnosed at OCD because she had to control everything that she had to do. And after talking a while with her, and we both recognized that this basically wasn't out of OCD typical thing, like what the Institute and contamination there description, but it was just that there was one part of her, we could call one triune brain, was very anxious about the situation. So that was trauma. Okay, that was regular trauma. And the other brain compensated that anxiety of that brain with okay, then we have to double check or triple check. Okay.
Yeah.
So that was basically, there was a dynamic of two brains, and one was in trauma and the other one was trying to help. And once that trauma was resolved, then the person was like, yeah, I can check, I don't need to, and I feel okay when I'm leaving the house without checking.
Gotcha.
Okay, so that was a simple case, and sometimes it's not that simple.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to talk to somebody who had I think it was either um bulimia or anorexia. I cannot remember at this point, but he was very fortunate to be able to kind of work through that in his own way. I don't really know how, and move past it in his life. And I asked him, like what happened, what made you, what was going on with you that made you deal with things in this way or have these behaviors. And the thing he said to me was, this was how I maintained control of my life. Like, it seemed like a lot of his life was going not the way he intended, but the one thing he could control was when he ate or what he did with his body in that aspect. And I was very young at that time, and I didn't really understand it much, but it was very interesting nonetheless. And it was very he was very self-aware to be able to see that. um but yeah, I just, the more we talk about these things, the more it's easier to get away from this labeling. And it's a double-edged sword, because it's important to an extent, right? It can then become a way of also not dealing with the actual thing. You can just say, like, like sometimes, when I before I started doing any kind of emotional work, the one coping mechanism I had was, when I felt really bad, I would just go read. I would just go watch YouTube videos on the things that I was dealing with. And just seeing somebody give me information uh, was good. It was important, but it also became a way of feeling better. And I think it can also happen when you are reading so much information and you're just trying to nitpick everything rather than start dealing with it. So, I mean, as you guys are therapists, so it's important for you guys to be able to differentiate and to understand it very well. But after a while, you have to do the work. Um, so yeah, um, I want to move a little bit more into.
This is just
Go ahead.
a little bit that what you described, say that's a very common way of intellectualizing and avoiding the actual problem. Our brains are remarkable. They can, when there is pain, when there is an emotion, somehow, and the brain can create like a train of thought and or logical argument or something, and then somehow the emotion fades away. It's not gone. It's still there. You can still be triggered, but it's not that present anymore.
Yeah.
And that is something I think in our Western society we tend to do very much. That we try to control many things, and with that control, also emotions fade. And then with the intellectualizing, with creating an argument, we also tend to think to solve our emotional issues, but actually don't. Yeah, it's just a way to cope.
Okay. Is there something you see with societies that tend to intellectualize most in how those things they're not dealing with tend to come out? Like, do people who tend to intellectualize more than feel, do they project stuff out more? Do they tend to have more, I don't know, like, yeah, I don't know, like somatic issues? Do they tend to
Yeah.
be more
So
explosive?
to have somatic issues is basically an escape mechanism of the body. So when you don't deal with your emotions, the body says, "Okay, then I'll deal with it," and then you get some somatic problems. That's common
Psychosomatic.
knowledge, even in mainstream psychology. So that's one thing, and the other thing we also discussed that in an earlier episode is that it backfires. Yeah, it's basically a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're trying to avoid something, and exactly that, what you're trying to avoid, is happening. And you
Yeah.
can see that very, very, very clearly also now in the pandemic. It's very neurotic, all these discussions about vaccination, not vaccination. It's not an intellectual, factual discussion. It's very emotional. And
Mhm.
most people try to hide it with arguments that it's emotional. but it's not. It's not very intelligent.
Gotcha. Yeah,
Yeah.
I see that. I see that a lot too, and in the discussions we have. I don't want to get political at all, but uh, just this, like when I see a lot of discussions online from how it's so divisive here. I don't know how Germany is, but it's extremely
So,
divisive here in the U.S. and it's just getting more and more. It seems, at least it seems like, and a lot of people try to talk about these points and this is right and you're an idiot and this and that. But I also, one thing I don't see is when people are trying to discuss, people are not looking at the feelings within uh, the person they're debating. So they're not, like they're trying to point why this person you're voting for is an idiot or this person is bad and this person's good. But like no one is saying like what made you come to these decisions emotionally. Like what happened in your life that made you see the world this way. It's always like these facts. And we've talked about this in the past. Like you'll see a lot, this quote said a lot, like facts or feelings aren't facts. And we said it before, but feelings are data and they give you a lot of information. And
oh yeah.
just because they're not these like objective material truths does not mean they're not important and even like necessary for like a more rounded discussion of how we see the world and how we make decisions.
That's awesome that you say that, Sergey, because actually it's the only truth that is. Okay,
What?
you can see what you, if you have a topic and then you have that division about to left and right or whatever, conservative and Republican or whatever, vaxxers,
Sure.
anti-vaxxers. The division is because we're not looking at the emotion. The emotion are the facts. So this person, that group, will not switch to that group if they're really hardcore, basically, because of the emotion, and vice versa.
Sure.
This person, that group, won't switch here because of the emotion. Okay, so actually, the fact can be seen from both sides and both perspectives. From their perspective, are 100% correct because the fact, the emotion, is not taken into consideration.
Yeah.
And so I like that question very much that you said. What made you see this way? How do you feel about it? Really feel emotional wise. But I think it's for most people that question would be something out of out of out of limit or out of bounds or something because it goes in a very personal. And I've seen in many discussions that people try to hide like this personal thing. There's this role, there's the personality, and that's represented, and the personal stuff is kept aside. So when I open the discussion into something that personal, okay, how did you come to that conclusion? What do you feel about it? What made you in your life come up with that argument? I'm basically going underneath that personality. I'm going into the person itself, and then I'm trying to understand that person. So then that person might do the same. And if I'm not sure about myself, I would now have to explain myself, and I couldn't hide away because I started it. So I think these discussions are avoided because as soon as I would do it, I would get the same question on my side, and then I would have to open myself up. And if I don't like that because I'm afraid of what's coming out, so I avoid these questions.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Well, I'm glad you see it that way too, because I think that's something that's definitely missing. Okay, well, I want to move forward a little bit on, and we've talked about this a bit, but on anxiety's cousin, and that's just depression. But I want to go from the perspective that you guys again have in the books, and it's for the same reason. When when we talk about anxiety here, one thing that um, I see two things, and I would love to hear your thoughts. The first one is that people say that when we talk about anxiety and depression, people will say, I hear this quote a lot. Depression is looking to the past, anxiety is looking to the future, and you should just be in the present. I personally hate that quote. I think it's so reductionist. I think it's so cheesy, and I think it doesn't help anybody. I hate that freaking quote. Um, but I also know that I've read a lot and I've seen that sometimes when people don't deal with their anxieties or what we call anxiety, it can accumulate and people might, become depressed. Now, these are just words. There's so much that, there's, I think when I first started, reading about your work and all that you do at the institute, I think one of the first videos that I saw was that it was Grant was saying that, you know, like this feeling of depression, it can be a lot of things. Like people might say they're depressed, but it can mean a host of things. They could be feeling heavy. They could be, feeling they could be feeling suicidal, and they're feeling like all these terrible negative feelings. It's important for them to immediately take care of themselves and find people that can support them. But there are so many things that can be depression. It could also just seem like the world is terrible. It can feel like they don't they don't feel a lot of things anymore. Like they're very numb to feelings. I kind of want to go a little bit what you guys, because I feel like this is better than you would see in most places, and that is there's a lot of feelings that can show up. So in the subcellular psychobiology book, it says things that might show up as depression can be a deep sadness that doesn't leave, dull, lethargic feeling, a feeling of being muffled, um, feelings of the futility of life, with thoughts about all the bad things that have happened to mankind, like genocide, Nazi crimes. Feelings are reduced. This can be lifelong or more recent. This is called by like flatten emotions. A feeling of reduced mental and physical energy or exhaustion, unable to connect to other people or feel love, a depression that is similar to someone else's, a heavy, weighed down feeling, and a reaction to losing a peak state. So those two things, that beautiful quote I gave you, and then all these things that show up. Um, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. But what are your thoughts on those things? Do you think that quote is what do you think about that quote? That motto, that yeah.
Mhm. I think I tend to agree with you. That's really an oversimplification. That probably just applies to a low percentage of what's actually bothering people.
And I mean, it's a very, very simple way of looking at it, but I have seen people who are depressed because of the uncertainty in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So that's already evidence that this quote is incorrect for everything. For certain, as Inka said, for a certain person it might be. Of course, in depression, we also have this metaphor and this figure of speech of the backpack with all your emotional baggage that you're carrying
Yeah.
around, and that might weigh you down, and that is very much to what you just read. Yeah, a feeling of heaviness and so on. It might be that emotional backpack.
Yeah.
But I think I think anxiety is per definition something in the future. So that makes a little bit of sense. Okay. So being afraid of something happening in the future, I think that's the more or less official definition of anxiety. And so, yes, but as I said, it could be for depression as well. Okay. Especially in those times right now that many people don't know because they don't know what's going to happen. So they lost their plan of life. They've lost their way of living. And so they might feel depressed. That's again a way how you react to a certain situation, which is described as depression. Depression itself is not a disease.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a complex of symptoms, and then it's not one disease.
Right. Okay. Um, so, I mean, I think the second part was really more of an answer. It's great that you guys have this so much because it's good to know. Yeah, when we have a limited language for these things, we have a limited um, space to talk about these things in general in society. Most people won't even say they're feeling depressed because it comes with this shame and this almost like failure in the part of the person, um, which sucks. But it's great that you guys have so many of these things because I feel like there are gonna be a lot of people that are gonna come and like I hope that people are when they watch this or if they're watching this right now, like there can be more than one thing, and maybe just hearing these things being read right now can be like, oh, okay, so like this is something I can deal with. Um this is something that I guess can be depression. I didn't even know that's what it was. um so yeah, so that's really good to know.
Mm.
um there's something else that I used to when I
Can
was in there.
I
Go ahead.
just put one sentence in there because I think you said something important here. The shame around even being in that state.
Yeah.
Um, that keeps people away. And I just want to put out, we as therapists, we don't have a judgment on that. Like, we understand that you might be feeling shame because of whatever belief you have about your condition. But we are just seeing this, oh, okay, today you're wearing your black shoes, yesterday you were wearing your sandals. It has about that degree of judgment to it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like pink t-shirt, green t-shirt, blue t-shirt, doesn't matter.
Yeah. Let's
The,
Yellow t-shirt, stereo, doesn't matter.
sorry?
yellow t-shirt.
Yellow t-shirt doesn't matter.
It is quite bright. Do you guys think that more education brings more less shame about these things? Because where does the shame come from? Like, people don't feel ashamed of having cancer or breaking their leg. Um, do you think education can kind of be an antidote, or do you think it's also like a passed down kind of generational shame?
I wouldn't say that people cannot feel shame for having cancer. I've seen that. Yeah.
Okay.
People feel shame because they're not healthy. And that's also a reason I think that's very individual and can be felt from for whatever reason. I don't know, Inke, do you have an idea of where shame comes from?
Okay, that's a bit far-fetched maybe, but I like to speculate a little bit here.
Yeah.
Essentially, all these judgments basically say that there's something wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
So from a peak stage perspective, we can call that a core issue, and we need to kind of like dig a little bit deeper what exactly it is that you believe there. But it's not far from the bottom of the belief system there. I wonder if from a social and generational perspective, we have been living for thousands of years in societies that could not afford, like hunter-gatherer and that area, that could not afford to have people something wrong with them,
Yeah.
because they couldn't sustain them. They couldn't afford to waste resources on a member of society that couldn't contribute.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that something's wrong with me stems generationally from that old age. Just a thought that passed my mind.
That's interesting. I've thought of that, not like that, but I've had like ideas that are similar to that before, because um yeah, because I felt like thinking about generations that were hunter gatherers and stuff like that, it was all survival. I mean, there was very little time for self-reflection. Like, how do I feel? There's this there's this quote. There's a comedian here in the US called Dave Chappelle. And he's an African American comedian. Talks a lot about race and the difficulties of African Americans. He's very, very funny. But there's this joke he says, which I feel like is extremely insightful. And he talks about how, like, he's very affluent. He has money. He's done very well for himself. And one of the jokes he says is, um, something happened to him, and he said, I did something that a lot of African Americans can't do in the US. And he said, like, I thought about how I felt. And the joke here is that most most people are living, most people are living with all these difficulties, economic, especially in the African American community. There's a lot more inequality here in the US. And so they're living more day to day, trying to survive, trying to just survive. And here's this one person that doesn't have to worry so much about the economic, and he's doing a little better. And the joke is that because he's like that, he can think about his feelings a bit more and he can self-reflect. And even though it was a very good joke the way he told it, I'm obviously butchering it, but the idea is the same, that because we're in these modes of survival, there's really not enough time to think about, okay, now I have a little bit time to heal and to think about my feelings and to reflect on my life and my decisions and my choices and why I do them. So, I mean, whether it's speculation or not, I feel like it has like solid roots at least. Um, w- what about? Do you guys hear the term situational depression a lot? Like, um,
Well, before we go to another topic,
sure.
so you just got a comment on Facebook, and where the comment is, I also think shame is typically something more associated with things that we can control, while the mental emotional condition is something most people believe they should be able to control.
So shame comes from not being able to control something.
No, shame is associated with things that we can control.
Oh, okay.
Here's the thing: the should is an absolute pointer that's actually coming from a core issue.
Why?
Why do you believe that you should be able to do that? Like, what does that even say? It says actually there's something wrong with you because you can't control it. You should be, but you can't. And
Right.
there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's a trauma. Yeah, I mean, there's why would you even believe that there's something wrong with you?
Actually, the should is something also recognized in mainstream psychology as a cognitive distortion, the should statement. And that is something that points towards a misbelief or a belief that is based on trauma. And so when people believe that they should be able to control their emotional or mental state, that is something, yeah. But that, I think that's with the shame is associated with shameful behavior, something. So you're behaving outside of your tribe. Okay, so there's a tribe and there are rules in the tribe, and because you violated the rules on purpose, possibly that's the observational bias there. That then shame should arise to bring you back into that, in line with the rules in the society, and that makes some sense to me. And for example, in case of survival, that would have been critical. Okay, so if you are in danger of being extinct, and then somebody plays outside, then perhaps the chances of survival are less. While on the other hand, and that's something that in the latest years we have seen, that basically not being in line with society is something that advances society and keeps society running. So if we think about all the disruptive technologies we have seen lately,
Yeah.
then it's always something society has said, no, it's not necessary. Yeah? The iPhone shouldn't have been necessary, and so on.
Yeah.
Things, the advances in society or in science as well, they have always been from outsiders. Not always, but many very disruptive things have been from outsiders, and that developed society further and further and further. And I think that is the interesting thing, that while society might believe that playing by the rules, playing by the book is keeping you safe, but actually the person not questioning the authority, questioning the rules, and thinking outside of the box is actually the person that helps society advance.
Yeah.
I mean, just look at the word disruptive. It used to be something definitely with a negative connotation, but
Yeah.
because slowly but surely we're becoming aware of the benefits of being disruptive, we're now going for disruptive technologies in order to advance.
Yeah. That's interesting. I never thought about that. Yeah, it used to be kind of like anti-authority, right? Or creating chaos. Now it's more like just shaking things up. Oh, okay.
Yeah, shaking things up was also not a good thing in the past, by the way. Yeah,
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point.
like that's kind of like
I wish I had better questions for you about shame, because I feel like it's a very, very I feel very like when I think about it, I feel like I have a very superficial understanding of it. But I have felt it, when I have been dealing with my issues. And I feel just like ashamed that this is happening to me. Like, and I can see it as a perspective of not being thinking that I should be able to control my environment and what I can do, um but
Oh,
I also
that's another thing. That's a beautiful one. That you think you should be able to control the environment. That is like, I would call it a God complex or something.
uh-huh.
Yeah, because why? I mean, you're not God, possibly, okay? And I don't know even if that concept can exist or not. I don't want to go into that. But somebody being able to control the environment is like more than him or herself. It's like the control of the environment, and usually that in most societies, this is somebody who's called to be a god.
but we still try to do it on an everyday basis. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
So it might be a very common issue.
Probably.
Oh, no. I think part of being human. Human beings are different from animals, if that is something that is even worth discussing, in that we are able to control our environment to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
We are changing our food from raw to cooked, so we're actively changing something about what we eat.
Maybe we just think we have more. We have more because we can shape things. We assume that we can do much more than we actually can.
That might be that, yeah.
But so how would you call that, Inga?
Sorry?
How would you call that if you think you can do more than you actually can? What's that?
Unrealistic. But sometimes necessary. Sometimes it's something that would also drive you forward to achieve positive changes. Like the whole thing that just because it hasn't been done before doesn't mean it's not possible to do it.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we'd be having this conversation if that wasn't the case, right? Because for so long, there psychology's been, about the ego and these unconscious processes, and even before that, there wasn't much. There was yeah, there wasn't much. So it's always been the people who can think about it differently and see beyond what is like remotely possible, especially living in a materialist from a solely materialistic perspective of what you can see outside yourself as being the main reality, as opposed to like I mean, everything you guys are doing is on the inside. I mean, it's all inside, and it's a massive world. It's like as deep as the ocean, or maybe even more. But um, um, I feel like my head is everywhere because I have a lot of questions, but at the same time, don't know where to continue. Um,
Well, let me just go back, perhaps, you to the one thing that we discussed earlier. So, if society is somehow in survival mode and tries to survive by sticking to the rules, and we and we come to a situation which hasn't been there. Okay, so there are no rules. Okay, there's no experience. So if rules are derived out of experience, okay. So if I heat water, it gets hot. So the rule is not to put your hand inside, because otherwise your hand burns. So that be the rule. You have made that rule up because of experience. But now there comes a new situation where you don't have experience. What do? Do you apply old rules to a new situation? Is that the clever way, or is it a clever way to try to understand that situation and try to deal with it in a way which hasn't been there before, which isn't described in the rules.
I think it takes a lot of a lot of presence of mind to be able to do that, because whenever I think humans in general are always going to try to, whenever they're in a new situation, they're going to try to rely on heuristics and things that have worked in the past for them. I think when that doesn't work, or when there's a need for innovation, then if you those I think those are also things that you need to learn, though. Like from a musician's perspective, it's very easy to go into the feelings and the things that you make you feel comfortable, even writing music, or even moving towards like a musical movement, because it's what works. And the feeling of like failing or not knowing if the next thing that you're going to do is outside of the boundaries of what you know can be jarring, can be uncomfortable. And unless you have techniques themselves to keep you in that state, it's very easy to regress to what you know. Because even if it doesn't work, there's a control, and there's a feeling of control. So you might just go to it because eventually it might work. It's very hard to try new things when, like, doing this work is difficult. Learning these tapping things and the associations and all the different techniques is very difficult. A, because I'm still living maybe like 70-30 in my head, and it just gets in the way. Um and B, because it's outside of, like, I work with my body a lot, and I'm very good at sports. So the kinesthetic part outside is easy, but inner work, kinesthetic, staying present, creating space, creating a container of safety. Um, these are things that I didn't learn, and these are things that I didn't know. Um, and it's very difficult because you rely on what you know, and even when it fails you, you still do. Like, even though I need to rely not to rely on my head is still like, no, 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 like, you should trust me, you really need to trust me. And it's wrong, but it's just difficult. It's very difficult. You have to be very conscious, and you have to slowly, you have to create a, I saw it recently and I love this term. You have to create like an unconscious cognitive response. So eventually you've done it so much with so much, it's like, it's like learning anything. You do it slowly, so much, and it's awful, and then eventually you just get muscle memory, basically.
Yes.
It's
But
like,
No, and
learning to
that's
drive. Yeah, when you do your first time in a car, you kind of like, what do all these labors do, and what do I have to do, and
yeah,
have to think of everything at once, and
yeah,
remember
like
to
sensory overload, kind
do
of.
this and that, and look in the mirror and whatever. And after a while, you kind of like do it automatically.
Yeah,
Basically, from we call that you're doing it from your bookmark. What is that? Ah,
from your spine, from your cerebellum, from your
yeah.
subconscious.
It's just
But
easy. It's automated.
I love what you just said, Stevie. On the one hand, as a side note, it's not for everybody that challenging. Okay, so everybody reacts to
yeah,
these techniques a little bit different. But what you just stressed is, if you're going outside your comfort zone, and for whatever reason, so the reason or the motivation for going outside the comfort zone, it's difficult. Okay, because the comfort zone, what you're used to, that's why we call it comfort zone. That's, things are easy, and then if we go outside, things are getting a little bit more difficult. And that's a good indicator. Okay, so it's an indicator when things get difficult, so that there's some sort of issue. Either it's an issue which is holding you back, or it's an issue that crossing that border outside the comfort zone is something, yeah, well, not so pleasant. But if there is a person who's actually dealing with himself, crossing the comfort zone, crossing that border, and then strives to new things, okay, and then society tries to hold him back and says, "Oh, you're violating the rules. You're violating the rules. It's dangerous, and so on, and we need to survive." Um, I think that society that does that is actually the society that as we discussed earlier, if you're trying to avoid something, you're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Is actually a society that will eventually die off. Okay,
Yeah.
so and we know basically two modes: the protection mode. Okay, when you basically go inside and close all the doors and try just to survive, and then the open mode where you basically try to do new things and try to venture.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that you should be either one. Okay, so both modes have advantages and disadvantages. But I think late in the latest years, society has become very protective. I think that has started with perhaps 9/11 or something like this, when people were aware of threats for their lives in their countries. So when there was somewhere outside, then it's sad, but it's not hurting me. But with 9/11, stuff came into the country, and since then, rules have been created to create safety. Okay, to induce safety, to look at how the liquid policy on airplanes changed, and many things that changed and have been very restrictive when we basically close ourselves off just to survive, instead of creating new ways of dealing with our problem. And I think a little bit that these innovative people right now, that's a very personal feeling of mine, are from society wise not that well received. While from my point of view, I receive them very well. I'm very keen on learning new things and having people with creative ideas and and people who have a dream, who have a vision, who have the ability to let society rules behind themselves and create something new. And a little bit is that what we want to try as well with our with our series of podcasts or video meetings. We want to show that there's a little bit more, a little bit outside of the box that you regularly know, that you have in your regular life, and then hopefully one day more people work with their emotions, work with their feelings, and know that there's an outside world and an inside world, and we can deal with both of them. Okay, we have tools also for dealing with the inside world, and that we can create a different way as a society works. Okay, not so much afraid of emotions, but integrating emotions very much into regular life, and then hopefully this topic of shame is also something that we tackle, and it's not inhibiting us on doing great things.
Yeah.
And I would like to take that further. I think like education is the key here. Coming back to education, you bring that in early enough that children can start dealing with their generational trauma load, basically, and you will have grown up people that are able to do so much more than what we accomplish in a lifetime right now.
Yeah, it's true. It's to
I
be
mean,
perfectly honest.
sorry, just to say that. So if you go on YouTube or TikTok or whatever, you see many people regressing to old times. Okay, they want to live with nature, they want to be inside of nature, and they live like our ancestors lived, in caves or in huts that are made out of clay and so on. And I'm not necessarily sure if that's the way to go. I encourage everybody who wants to experience that lifestyle, but I think basically having done all these development steps until here and then just going back without changing something fundamentally, I think is an issue. But if we continue, but perhaps in this continuation of that process, we're not creating an utopia or a Tomorrowland like you see in Disney World, but okay, where you have flying cars, or in all these sci-fi movies where you have flying cars and flying autobuses and stuff like this, but where we create something where we take our knowledge from the outside world, generate more knowledge on the inside world, generate more knowledge on what humans actually can do, and then integrate that into something that creates a society with all that knowledge, not regressing, but progressing to something much more in harmony with nature, and not creating exhausts that go into nature, but creating something that actually can be introduced in all these cycles that nature works in.
Yeah, I think from I'm glad you brought TikTok into this in social media because I mean I'm in it quite often and I enjoy reading the cultural perspective that it brings because you get to learn. After a while, it stops being anecdotal and it becomes like statistical. Because you see so many of the same thoughts and behaviors of people, and when you talk about people going wanting to go back to nature, at least from the US perspective, I think it's because this idea that our certain the certain systems that we have, even though we're advancing, they're not creating these spaces for a relaxation, and b internal work. They're not creating space for inner work and time to grow, right? So I think the idea is that if you go back to nature, there's less pressure on you from, work 9 to 5 work, and you can just be in a farm and you can create peace that way. Whereas right now, there's society's not really creating a lot of opportunities. Like, and I think about it from TikTok and YouTube because I know that a lot of the big TikTok community, it's worldwide, but I see the US and people don't have there's not a lot of great health insurance for mental health. There's not a lot of great insurance for regular health. It's super expensive. um and people are just working 9 to 5s to just eventually work on what they want to do, so there's not a lot of time for that. And I think it's this idea that you'll be able to find that inner peace that you want out there in nature, or at least find that space. um, that's just the way I see it, and I say that because I feel that way a bit. When I look at these videos, I'm like, oh, that looks beautiful. Like if I could just go there, you know, all the times that I want to just go and do some inner work, or at least meditate, or at least just do my own thing, it's it's idyllic. Like I think of that, of going there. I'm like, oh, perfect. Like then every single day I would wake up every morning and just do 2 hours of like trauma work or whatever I would do, and it would be perfect. And I think that's where it comes from a little bit, but it made me think that we could, if we had a better system, if we had people that were more grounded and a lot clearer, they could be the ones that continue to create that, not a utopia, but that feeling of nature, that sense of safety that nature can create if you're at peace, and just bring it to this urban world that we're creating, alongside with better ways of living, and better systems that benefit everybody. Um, but yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I think a lot about, actually.
Yeah, so I'm not really convinced that back to nature is a mistake there. I think it's a very intuitive way of people to remember that on this planet, long term survival is only possible together with nature. You can't go
Yeah,
against nature all the time and expect this planet to survive. If you damage all the cycles of renewal, the, the, the survival of the race is threatened, really, and along with everybody else and everything else on this planet. So, going back to nature as a point of remembering, hey, we got off track here somewhere. We need to be more aware of of the consequences of what we're doing. I mean, I keep getting this little quip in my head that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, even though you already know it's wrong and still expect a different outcome. And that's what we're essentially doing every day if we're examining our lifestyles. So we
Yes.
definitely need to look at what we're doing here and come up definitely not with old ways, maybe with new ways, yeah, more modern
yes,
ways, but ways that are more compatible with our environment. And going into nature for inspiration to do that, and to kind of like cycle back to the place where to find out where did we go off track
sure.
may not be a stupid idea at all. Yeah.
Yeah,
But it's not
No,
that
but
kind of
please,
utopia where
please,
you can
Inga.
just go and relax and avoid dealing with the responsibilities that you have.
sure.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. So I didn't want to claim it as a stupid idea, but I was exactly going into that direction, that we were saying that if we do stuff over and over again, it doesn't make it better. So if we now start and live like in the 18 or 1700s, again, it doesn't solve the problem where we went off the path. And I love that the example that Sergio gave because basically when there are two effects when you go into the forest right now, and that's also something recognized in mainstream psychology and psychotherapy, that has a healing effect. Okay, with all these if that's a big forest and all these substances that are exuded from the trees and from the plants, and we know that this has a healing and calming effect. So when you actually go there will be a little bit of that inner peace that you desire. On the other hand, you always have your emotional backpack with you, and your conditioning and the way you look at things. And if you don't go there and change, there will be not much change. So you have to have that willingness to deal with all these things. You have to have first of all, you have to have the knowledge that there's an outside world and an inside world, and that the outside world can help you to calm your inside world a little bit. But there's more to it. There's more observation. Either way, either school, if you do vipassana or you meditation, you do healing this on that way, doesn't really matter as long as you look into the inside world. We prefer a very effective approach to it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best. There are many of them, and so yes, if you go into nature, if you watch these TikToks, and we are reminded that there's some stimuli in our head that this is basically the way we want to live. Yeah, we want to wake up when it's light, and we want to go to bed when it's dark, because that's how our bodies were programmed, without that natural lights and so on, without these natural lights here. And so that's fantastic. But I think that there's a progress and not a regression. Okay, so if we would go and, for example, I have some missing knowledge about how to do things they did in the 1700s. So if I go back and give that knowledge, I could do it exactly the way they did it. But then I would end up here again. So if I do this and I take that knowledge and apply it forward and try to find a way to build the houses differently, but using ancient techniques, or applying part of the ancient technique plus the modern technique of statics and so on, then I think we have progress. And that's actually what I would like to promote, that we take the other turn, that we go to nature. Yeah, we are part of nature, but we have, I think, a very human trait is what Inka said, is that nature always has cycles. Okay, so there's no waste deposit or something in nature, because if you look at the earth, there's nothing you can do get outside of the earth. So the earth has to deal with their things inside her ecosystem, and develop cycles. Okay, so plants break down, and then there are organisms eating the plants, and these organisms create something that plants then can eat again, and so there's a cycle. But what very, very human tradition is basically to just take one thing they need, and don't respect the cycle. And I think that's also something the industrial human does more than the aborigine, than the original human. That the original human respects those cycles and respects nature to let it grow. And that's more in their tradition. While in the modern industrial world, it's not so much. And in that we progress using this knowledge, using, for example, permaculture, respect cycles, these cycles. But obviously, life will then change. We can't sit so much time in front of Netflix anymore, because we have to do some work in our permaculture gardens to help these cycles and to live with nature.
But I also think that would, if things go well, that would be great, because I feel like most people who are watching Netflix and living in this sedentary style are also living it a large percentage to cope, right? So if it's not that, oh, this is the ultimate, the peak level of human like existence, like as you guys are saying, the peak level of existence is just feeling great. And when things are feeling great, you gravitate towards things that create, that allow you to be who you are, to put it like plainly. And that could be, you've always wanted to create a forest, I mean, you see it in stories. There are people that can do like incredible things. Like I've seen the story of a guy who like replanted an entire forest over like a number of years, and I'm like, you have to be in a fantastic state of being to be able to do that, you know? Like you can't have things blocking you from giving back to the world because that's who you are. If you're in a healthy state of being, you're gonna project you I don't want to say project, but you're gonna give that out to the world. Um and when you're in these states where right now, where I think is where we are, is like we're in a stage where we're using a lot of coping mechanisms and we're still seeing a lot of war and a lot of hatred and um we're still seeing that, but ultimately like we have to, I think that nature is really important to in general, just to be able to create these levels of peace. And I think that's why we're seeing it more, and we're not getting, I think in current urban systems we're not really getting that, and I think that's why we're seeing that a lot more. um
You mentioned that people feel better in a natural environment, and
yeah,
why not make use of that fact, and from that feeling better, then come up with better ideas how to live, and not basically live like caged chickens, each in their predefined little cage and laying an egg every 8 hours, you know.
yeah, yeah, I agree. And I
Those
also know,
8 hours that you owe society in terms of productivity, and that keeps you totally estranged from who you're really supposed to be.
yeah, but here's the question I keep trying to gravitate back to, and I forget, but I remember now. That's what I wanted to talk to you guys about, like situational. There's this term like situational depression, um, where like, oh, you're feeling this way because of how life is right now. Like if your environment were to change, you wouldn't feel this way. And I think that's where, like, I think about TikTok, because TikTok, you see that a lot. You see people frustrated about their 9 to 5s, and they just, and people are talking about trauma a lot, but they
Yeah.
do you think situational depression is just, again, you something unconscious about you made you fall into these patterns? Because a lot of
I
people do
would
random
say
things.
that some of it is a bit of drinking too much caffeine and wondering why you're not feeling good, you know?
Okay.
If you are permanently living against what your system has evolved into, we have adapted to a certain way of life over eons. And
Hmm.
then within the last few generations, all of that has been turned upside down. The environment has changed. Our way of life is totally different. And we expect ourselves and our bodies to be okay with that. Um, it doesn't make sense, really. Yeah. You have a highly specialized life form. And instead of letting it live in the environment that it has specialized in, you take it out of that environment and say, now you have to get clear with this one. Now you have to manage your life here, and you ought to be happy and a productive member of society, period. You know,
Yeah.
it's not working. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. No, I
telling the
agree.
fish to fly and blaming it for falling out of the sky. Then it's that's not
Yeah, I agree. And
not,
so
not
when I think a lot about trauma healing and stuff like that, I think about it in this perspective that we are living in a lot of ways in these still survival, with these survival, in a survival mode, because we still have to do these things to survive, to be fed, and there are people who are on the street who can't, and I think a lot of that is a lot of trauma. They just can't even cope with those survival needs that the world sets upon you.
So here's an interesting question. Can we, rather than develop ways to balance something that we're not designed to do, can we develop a new set of metabolic pathways that allows us to fly, to so to speak? Is that where we are supposed to go, or
I think so.
you know?
Well, or what?
More, well, I know if I really want to be able to live in a polluted world and full with um, unnatural, and like putting me in an unnatural environment and not allowing me to connect with nature and still be okay with that. I find it
Yeah.
really hard to imagine that that is a way to prosper on a personal or species level.
Yeah. There is. I'm googling right now because I want to say it right. It's the. It's the. Have you guys heard of the like 100th monkey effect?
Yeah. Like you have to get a certain threshold of people who are able to do certain things.
And then it kind of just propagates.
Propagates through the whole society. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's irrelevant with I think the way it was done was like they put monkeys on one island, but then they also put them in a different island, and for whatever reason, the monkeys on the other island knew how to do it after a certain time,
I
right?
think that's Rupert Sheldrake's work. Yeah.
Yeah, which is A, insane, but B, it would be irrelevant with the advent of the internet at this point. If that we but still a very interesting concept because we have the knowledge that can be passed down through the internet, right? But I that's the way I'm thinking about it when you're talking about like being able to fly, right? Like if we're able to create systems where people are meeting, balanced systems within themselves where they can um, have some open doors and some closed doors within them, like Daniel said, where there's a good balance, where they can meet the status quo, but also go beyond it if they, where they see that they can be a positive disruption. And we can begin to not only just I think that's what's happening right now. People are questioning their feelings. People are questioning the way they feel. They're not okay with it anymore. They're not okay with just like watching Netflix all day or just smoking themselves to death or just, doing the same things that have been done before. I think people are questioning that a lot more. You see it a lot in social media. It's kind of it has a culture of its own, this sort of questioning and this sort of the videos that come out and stuff. um, I think that's where it happens, right? I think that when people start to question, where they start healing and they start breaking these limiting beliefs and they start creating more because they don't have these limitations and they start feeling better, then more options are available to us in our mind and we can create better choices for ourselves. And just like the 100th monkey effect, I think that's where change happens. I think that's where society takes a turn. And I think that's where it always does. It's just that with the set of behaviors that we have limited to us based on the trauma that holds us back, I think that's what we get, right? So it's like if you throw all these ingredients, then what you get is this society that has these problems. But when you have more ingredients or better ingredients, then like the food you're going to be serving is going to taste different and it's going to be different. So I think it's like what we're seeing is just a result of all that, right? But if we have better systems, then eventually I think that happens beyond like what one person can do. But at the same time, it has to start somewhere, right? And I think that these techniques are just um, a great way to start. All these that are being developed, and it's like you said, they're easier for some people than most. If you find that peak states or tapping or wholehearted healing is easy for you, then fantastic. If um, if chemotherapy works better for you as a way to start, great. If you um, learn about somatic experiencing and that's more helpful to you, great. But they're here, and that's where we can start. I think, yeah, like you said, we just have to just educate. I think education takes a bit of that shame away, and it gives a door so that people can become to give it a shot. But at the end of the day, I think that's the most we can do. That's about as godlike as we're gonna get. So yeah, that's what I.
That's a very nice analogy, and to close our chat for today. We just got another comment, and that's also very interesting to see, and that that back to nature basically gives an urgency. If you sit at home on your sofa and you still can order at the pizza place, you don't necessarily go out and farm your garden, but if you live in nature, you have to do it. You have to do that kind of work on the outside. And as we discussed, hopefully also what you just said, say you named lots of therapies on the inside as well. So my strong belief is if we just do it on the outside, we're basically not progressing, but we are regressing. Okay, we are regressing to the 1700s or something or earlier, and we're just reliving what has happened there, and that's not progress. But if we do the inner work and go back to nature, that's from my perspective a way to bring back harmony also to nature, to restore these cycles that we have interrupted with our way of living, and because of perhaps pure survival. Okay, we didn't know better at that time when we disrupted these circles, so I'm not adding any blame there. It's just the way how it developed until today, and now with our knowledge and our tools, there can be a different way. So join this movement.
It's a back to the future effect. Yeah, you go back into the past, but with the knowledge of what went wrong, so that you can decide for a different future.
Sure.
Yes.
Like, because what we've been doing so far as a race was like, give me what you got and to hell with tomorrow. That's how we're living right now. And I think we all have to become aware that that's something that won't really give us a future. Yeah.
All right. Well, this was great. Thank you so much for your time, for your insight, Inka, Daniel, and that's all I got. Is there anything else you guys want to add before we go?
I think that's. Thank you very much, Sergio. It was a beautiful session again, and we're up for number 15 then.
Yes, we are. All right, looking forward to it. Y'all be safe. What time is it over there? Like 9?
Getting
almost
9. Okay. Well, I hope you have a great evening, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Thank you, Sergio.
Next time. Bye-bye.
Bye, Inka. Bye, Daniel.